What is up, guys? Delboy here, bringing you a quick preview and prediction for Anthony Dirrell versus Avni Yildirim. This fight takes place on the 23rd of February and it goes down in Minneapolis, USA. A quick preview and prediction for this fight. This fight is for the vacant WBC Super Middleweight title. That belt was held by David Benavidez, but he was stripped/vacated that title because he failed a drug test. He actually tested positive for cocaine. Obviously Benavidez was partying a bit too hard. But yeah, he was the champion, he got stripped, and now these two guys fight for the vacant title. I believe Benavidez is still mandatory though. He should fight the winner of this fight. Anthony Dirrell versus Avni Yildirim. Where do we start with this fight? I've got to say, I do make Anthony Dirrell a favourite. I believe overall he is a more experienced fighter and he's more proven at a higher level than Avni Yildirim. I mean, Anthony Dirrell does hold wins over Sakio Bika and Caleb Truax. He actually knocked out Caleb Truax in one round, and this was before Caleb Truax went on to beat James DeGale, so that win has aged quite well. And overall, I believe, Anthony Dirrell has performed better at a higher level. Even if we look at the draw and loss on his record, in the draw with Sakio Bika, he was very competitive, and even in the loss to Badu Jack, he had his moments, he won rounds, just didn't do enough. He was still competitive though. So to me, Anthony Dirrell is just far more proven at a higher level than Avni Yildirim, and I believe Dirrell is more experienced. I mean, if we look at Avni Yildirim, he does have a few decent wins at a certain level. He beat Marco Antonio Paraban. That was a decent win. He did actually beat Derek Edwards, but Derek Edwards was a bit past his best. He's also got a win over Lalenga Mock. I know Lalenga Mock was, at an advanced age, but Lalenga Mock was coming off some good form, so that was a decent win. Avni Yildirim has also beaten Glenn Johnson, so they're his best wins, and, they're either wins against guys who were completely past their best, or guys who were kind of fringe level. He hasn't got the likes of Sakio Bika on his resume. He doesn't have the likes of even a Caleb Truax on his resume in terms of wins. And the one time Yildirim stepped up to near world level was against Chris Eubank Jr. and he got blitzed in, I believe, 3 rounds. He really struggled with the speed and athleticism of Eubank that night. And he just performed terribly. And I think you'll be hard pressed to find people who say Eubank Jr. is a top 5 super middleweight. So what level is Avni Yildirim actually operating at? I don't think he's a top 10 level fighter in the division, and I think he is some way off world level. I would say he's a good European level fighter. And looking at the style matchup, to me Anthony Dirrell, I mean, he's always been the lesser talented brother out of the two. Andre Dirrell historically was always the guy who was supposed to go further, but funnily enough, Anthony Dirrell was the only one who won a world title. I would describe Anthony Dirrell as a fairly well-rounded fighter. He has decent power, he has decent hand speed, he can work the body, he has pretty good punch combinations, he's got good textbook boxing, good jab, good right hand, he can box from range. I would describe Anthony Dirrell as one of those fighters who, he does most things well, but I wouldn't really say he excels in one area. In terms of criticisms for Anthony Dirrell, you could argue he kind of shies away in sort of dogfights, and when things get tough he doesn't really react well. That is a criticism that has been laid at both Dirrell's feet, and maybe there's something in that. But can Avni Yildirim bring that out in him? I'm not sure. I think Avni Yildirim has a style that could potentially give Anthony Dirrell problems, but to me, Avni Yildirim hasn't perfected that style enough to really get to Anthony Dirrell. Avni Yildirim to me is like a B-Tech Arthur Abraham. He fights in a similar style to Arthur Abraham, but doesn't carry it out nowhere near as effectively. Avni Yildirim comes forward with a pretty tight high guard and he'll try and walk you down. While walking you down, he will try and use a ramrod jab to close the distance, and he'll throw chopping overhand shots. But to me, he was nowhere near as effective as Arthur Abraham in that style. If you look at Abraham, especially when he was at middleweight, Abraham, he did come forward, he used that high guard, but the difference between Abraham and Yildirim is, first and foremost, Abraham just keeps that shape a lot better, he's a lot more compact, but when his opponent is throwing, Abraham would take it on the high guard, but he'd throw either right at the end of his opponent's combinations or in between his opponent's punches, and Abraham had very good timing out of that high guard. Yildirim doesn't do that, he just soaks up, and in the exchanges, Yildirim is terrible. We saw that against Chris Eubank Jr., he got himself knocked out when he tried to exchange. Abraham wouldn't do things like that. He'd take it on the guard and he'd time his punches. He would time in between your punches with short chopping right hands or at the end of your combinations. Abraham had far better timing than Yildirim, he was far more cerebral, he was a far better boxer than Yildirim. Like I said, Yildirim comes forward in that same stance and that same guard, but Yildirim's offense out of that guard is nowhere near as good as Abraham's, it's really not. The main issues I have with Yildirim's offense out of that guard, the first thing is he doesn't know when to throw his punches. That was painfully obvious in the Eubank fight. But also, you know, in that guard, to me it's beneficial to throw straight punches, and Yildirim throws these looping right hands. And, you know, that was the reason why Eubank Jr. knocked him out. He got there first, you know, he was throwing these looping shots and Eubank just kept timing him. And Eubank's not a great counterpuncher. So if Yildirim hasn't improved on that and tightened up, you know, I think Anthony Dirrell is going to have a lot of opportunities to land his straight punches. You know, that straight right hand of Anthony Dirrell is a good punch, and I think that punch could be key for him, especially if he gets his timing down. You know, Anthony Dirrell has got respectable power, he does have respectable hand speed. I think he can find the target on Avni Yildirim as he comes forward, letting his hands go. And another thing, Yildirim doesn't really close the distance that quickly. I could see Anthony Dirrell fighting on the back foot, using that jab and just keeping it at range. So I do believe Anthony Dirrell has most of the stylistic advantages going into this fight. Can Avni Yildirim have success? Yes, because I do question Anthony Dirrell's fighting heart. I do question his ability to deal with adversity. So let's say Avni Yildirim is still there after 6 or 7 rounds and he's still coming forwards. It's going to be interesting to see how Anthony Dirrell deals with that. I think Dirrell needs to stay off the ropes because, you know, Yildirim is a good body puncher against stationary targets, and he can let his hands go against stationary targets. He'll change the levels, he's got decent power. So Dirrell needs to avoid being on the ropes and he needs to avoid being in the corners, because that's when Yildirim can have success. You know, Anthony Dirrell's not exactly a great fighter in the pocket or when his back's against the ropes. So in those opportunities, Yildirim really needs to make the most of it. Yeah, I think those opportunities are going to be few and far between, so he needs to take them and he needs to make it a rough and tough fight. For me, this fight just favours Anthony Dirrell. To me, he's a better boxer. To me, his style is kryptonite for Avni Yildirim. Also, Anthony Dirrell is the taller, longer guy. Avni Yildirim is 5'11" with a 70-inch reach, whereas Anthony Dirrell is 6'2" with a 74.5-inch reach. So Dirrell has 3 inches on height and 4.5 inches in reach. And when you're fighting against a guy who is slow at closing off a distance, you know, that really does play into your advantage. To me, Anthony Dirrell should win this fight. Stylistically, it's made for him. I expect him to win this fight by a late stoppage or a points win. Share your thoughts below. Peace.